Well, Senator Lieberman and Representative Hurd, thank you for joining us in the Summer Catalyst, where we're focusing on creating a more perfect union. Senator Lieberman, you describe centrism as a strategy, not a philosophy. Representative Hurd, you describe yourself as a pragmatic idealist. So what do you all mean by those terms?
Well, first off, Bill, great to be with you. And thanks for focusing on the subject of a more perfect union, because I must say, certainly in my lifetime, which is not short anymore, thank God, this is the least perfect our union has been. And we're very divided now and imperfect, and that weakens us in so many different ways. So, and I think one of the ways back is for to reunite us and to have us be more perfect, is to bring the government back to what I call centrism, because centrism is the way to get things done. So I distinguished in my book, and I guess in my life, centrism from moderation. Centrism is not an ideology. In some ways, it's a strategy, but it's an open-mindedness. You could be a centrist if you're a Democrat, Republican, independent, liberal, conservative, moderate. The question is, are you willing to come to the center and meet people who have different points of view, different labels next to their name, and talk about a problem that the country has or an opportunity in a way that's respectful, constructive, informative? And then are you willing to negotiate, compromise, and get something done for the country, which is the way it's always been done and almost always done from the center? So that's what I mean about centrism, and why I think it's so important to get back to.
And I'll just pick up on what the senator said. Look, this notion that centrism or even moderates is a lack of ideology. That's the wrong take. You know, the folks that are actually trying to get things done, we're trying to figure out where is there overlap between different ideologies and focus on that. I used to get upset when people use the term moderate almost as a pejorative term. And I would always say, hey, I'm the one as a Republican taking conservative values in the Democratic areas to independents and changing hearts and minds. We're the ones that do all the heavy lifting, right? It's easy to preach. It's easy to preach to the choir. And I think there's a failure in Congress of how we negotiate. We usually start with each side comes with, this is the 100 things I want to do. And then it gets whittled down to 7. You negotiate through subtraction. So when you finally get something done, you're like, we left 93 things on the table. In the private sector and in industry, you start with, here's the one thing I want. And then the other side said, well, that one thing equals these 2 other things. And then you go back and forth and you come up with 15 or 16 things and you negotiate through addition. And you feel like everybody is one. And that's where I wish Congress would get back to. And I think when Senator Lieberman was there, when I first got into Congress, when you had rank and file members doing the negotiation and working, and you had committees doing the work, rather than having leadership design everything, you were able to get things done because of those relationships. And you asked, my phrase is pragmatic idealism. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? You have to have a vision of where you're going. You got to have a vision of what these things you are doing is trying to get us to. And so for me, that's the idealist part. Like, how do we help the greatest number of people possible? But the pragmatic piece is based on the realities on the ground now. We don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a perfect world. We got to accept and understand where we are now. Then that's going to be able to help us chart a course to where we want to go in the future.
Hey, Will, I like your term pragmatic idealism because, and I think you covered in what you said, that to be a centrist or a pragmatic idealist doesn't mean that you leave your ideals or your ideology or your ethics. You're just trying to work with people who have a different point of view to see if you can get something done. And maybe one of the best ways to make this real is with personalities. Teddy Kennedy was a very liberal Democrat. Orrin Hatch was a very conservative Republican. And yet on some major issues, they came to the center because they were the leaders of the relevant committee and negotiated really important agreements on things like children's health insurance that had a big effect. Incidentally, it would be irresponsible not to say that one of the great centrist accomplishments of my 24 years was under President Bush 43, which was the adoption of the No Child Left Behind Education Reform Act. And just not to go on too long, but basically, President Bush really wanted to get this done. And he came to the center and dropped some things that he wanted originally because they would have made it impossible to get a majority. And we brought into the room where he did Teddy Kennedy, liberal Democrat, Judd Gregg, this is in the Senate, conservative Republican, and Evan Bayh and me, who had a centrist sort of Democratic Leadership Council proposal. And we compromised. And I thought that was one of the major accomplishments of President Bush's administration.
But you point out, and sorry, this is what happens when you get two politicians.
That's all right.
We're gonna keep going. We're gonna keep going back and forth.
That's why we have you.
He inspired this notion. I think there's been this fundamental flaw in thinking over maybe 30 years, definitely the last 20 years, that the only way to get big things done in the government is through unified rule, where one party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House. That's actually the worst way to get things done. And when you look at all the pieces of legislation we know by name, starting with the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Social Security Acts that happened in the 70s, you name it, No Child Left Behind, most recently the First Step Act, all of these things that were enduring, lasting legislation was done when you had two different parties in the House and the Senate and a different party in the presidency. That's how you actually get big things done, not this notion that unified government works. And then another scary trend that's happening is the political continuum is no longer a line. It's a horseshoe. And the edges, the extremes, the nuts are closer to each other than they are to the middle. And so that's why we got to get back to where the majority of the country is, and that's in the center.
To allow you, Bill, to ask a question, or Matt, I'm just going to say in response to Will's last statement, amen, brother. You're right.
All right. Let me fast forward to today. If you all were attempting to put together a governing coalition today, what domestic issues would you focus on?
Obviously, if you get together on anything that related to the immediate challenge we have of inflation, that would be great. But it's hard to do. They've been trying to do it. So what are the gnawing problems we have? Listen, immigration is really tearing at us. And yet members of Congress, the majority in each house will generally tell you they could outline a proposal that would work if the ends of that U-shaped Congress that Will has talked about. You used the word nuts. My dear buddy John McCain his favorite word was wackos. There are wackos in both parties that have too much power. You could get this done, and it would allow people to come in to the country legally, which is a great source of strength for America. But you can't have open borders. You have to have some kind of rules for that to happen. So that would be one. The other would be how do we create, sort of public-private partnerships for economic innovation and growth that can allow us to compete with the Chinese, whose government is totally involved in the private sector, and part of why they're making such advances. And that ought to be a subject of bipartisan, centrist, pragmatic, idealist agreement. Those are two that come to my mind.
It's funny that Joe mentioned immigration. That was the first thing that came to my mind. When I was in Congress, representing more border than any other member of Congress, the crisis that's happening on our border it's worse than it's ever been. And the reality is, when you talk to people, when you talk to Democratic mayors and county judges along the border, when you talk to people like Henry Cuellar, who really understands the border probably better than anyone else, there are actually some areas of overlap on how you achieve border security. Stop treating everybody like an asylum seekers is step one. But when you streamline legal immigration, especially at a time when every industry needs people.
Right.
This is the time we should be streamlining legal immigration at a time when we're worried about recession and being able to pay down our national debt. Having more taxpayers paying taxes into the system is another positive. Oh, and by the way, when Joe's talking about what the Chinese government and their industrial policy is, if if the Chinese are stealing our technology, let's steal their engineers. If you're going to come to the United States of America and go to SMU to get an engineering degree, let's get you your degree and then your visa, right? Like this shouldn't be hard. And one topic that has always been near and dear to my heart, and it's going to be affected soon, is DACA. 72% of Republican primary voters believe DACA kids and young men and women in the DACA program should have a legal status in the United States of America. But both sides want to use this as a political bludgeon. And again, it starts with let members that know each other and understand these issues work on it and bring legislation to the floor. Because I know there's a way to get 250 votes in the House, and there's likely a pathway for 60 in the Senate on this particular issue that is affecting and will hit all those key things that Americans are caring about right now.
Since we're talking about immigration, let me just shift to that. And as you mentioned, Congressman Hurd, your district had the longest stretch of U.S.-Mexico border of any congressional district, so this issue obviously urgently. You talk about it in your book. For both of you, why do you think that the traditional bargain that has in the past always led to immigration reform, which is border security in exchange for enhanced border security in exchange for immigration reform, why isn't that working in this case?
So here is what happens: the edges, the extremes of both parties are preventing folks from solving this problem. Far left wants open borders, right? Which is crazy. You can't operate that way. And the far right wants to restrict immigration further than whatever has. Like, these are two extreme positions that are actually not good for our country. And so they are causing those two sides are causing leadership in both parties from working a deal. Because when Republicans were in power, they didn't want to work with a set of Democrats to pass something because Republican leadership would have gotten attacked by their far right wing. Same thing right now for the Democratic Party, putting forward things that make sense. They're going to get attacked by the far left progressives. That's what's preventing this from happening. And what's scary to me is right now we're at a point where the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico can potentially deteriorate pretty significantly. The rhetoric, I know, President Lopez Obrador and President Biden are meeting soon. Hopefully that can tamp down some of the rhetoric. But when you have 100,000 people missing in Mexico, you have the worst number of politicians killed in a really long time. You have citizens of northern Mexico as frustrated with the border situation that most Americans and a lot of Texans are upset with, because citizens of northern Mexico are saying, hey, President Lopez Obrador, you said you were going to secure our southern border, and you haven't done that. All of these things are coming to head, and we could potentially have some of the most friction, one of the more difficult times in our bilateral relationship in a really long time. And a lot of this is driven by this issue of immigration. Oh, and by the way, address root causes in places like the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Matt, let me add a sort of a case study which ends happily. So maybe it's important to give one of those about exactly what we're talking about. This is about 3 or 4 years ago. Will was there. He may remember the details better than I do, but there was a public outcry about the way in which children of families applying for asylum status, or children even who were stopped on their way over alone, the way they were being kept, and inhumane conditions. And the Senate put together a bipartisan bill with over 90 votes for it. So you had left, right, everybody. It went to the House, and what happened was just people were going to play by the playbook without using their heads or hearts. So there was a group on the right that said, oh, this is like a giveaway. And then there was a group on the left who said, this is not what these kids need. And it looked like it was going to get stopped, in spite of the fact that it had over 90 votes in the Senate. And there was a really, I must say, at these times, inspiring uprising by the centrists, by the pragmatic idealists in the middle, who said, we can't let this happen. And they pushed it with the leadership, and it got passed. I mean, because once they challenged the left and right, everybody said, this is ridiculous. There's both the problem that Will is talking about in that case, and fortunately in that case, a constructive and productive resolution of the problem.
Here's hoping that can happen again.
Yeah, and I'll just also add, going into 2023, if the economy gets worse, right, this is going to create an environment which makes it even more difficult to have conversations on this particular topic. So timing matters as well, and that's why when at that moment when employers need people, right, when customers are sick and tired for one, it's like your price of goods are increased because you don't have enough people producing those goods and providing those services. And so the public is looking for some change. This is a way to address that.
Thinking about foreign policy, and given the way partisanship has really seeped into the debate, I'm curious, Senator Lieberman, how does that leave, or where does that leave centrists? And analogously, Congressman Hurd, if China's not going to be a responsible stakeholder, where does that leave pragmatic idealists?
Yeah, so there's no question that the partisanship at home and the division makes us weaker in the world because the other countries see it. It actually shakes the confidence of our allies around the world because they see that we're having trouble getting our act together, even on foreign policy, and it encourages our enemies. And they argue this. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians, for instance, say, we're obviously, I mean, those U.S. can say it's a great democracy, but look what it gets it, nothing. Nothing's happening for its people. We have, if you read the joint communique that President Xi and Putin put out in February, right before the Olympic Games in Beijing, it's an incredibly detailed attack on the U.S. and our democracy because of this division. So it's another reason for us to get together. Look, the great paradigm of the model here is in foreign policy is the relationship after the Second World War between Democratic President Harry Truman and the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg, who had been an isolationist in the 30s, really was pushing Roosevelt to sort of compromise with the Japanese. He said after Pearl Harbor, if you were still an isolationist, you were not a realist. And he formed this partnership with Truman where they adopted all the great post-war institutions, NATO, the World Bank, all of it. And that created security and prosperity for the world for decades afterward. But Vandenberg said, and we've forgotten this famously, he actually said it, I did some research on this, Republicans, his fellow Republicans were bothering him. Why are you working so closely with Truman? We think we can beat Truman in 1948. And he said, partisanship in politics must end at the water's shores, or the nation's shores. In other words, at our borders. That's a great, and not that there, and he made clear, he didn't mean there couldn't be differences of opinion about foreign policy, but if they were based on your party label, that really weakened America. And of course, that's what's happened now over and over and over again.
Not enough people recognize that foreign policy is not foreign, right? It has an impact here at home. And, I've always said that the U.S. became a world superpower after World War II, when we gave a helping hand, and Arthur Vandenberg helped architect the Marshall Plan with George.
Right.
But we actually, that's when we started acting like it's a global superpower. actually became a global superpower in the middle of World War I, when our GDP surpassed the British for the first time in history. And it starts with making sure and articulating the case that having alliances and entangling alliances is actually good for us now. That may not have been a bad idea back when the founders started this little experiment called America, but that was when all of Americans could have fit in Los Angeles, right? And that's not the case anymore. So it starts with that. The one good thing, there's a few truly bipartisan issues in Washington, D.C. still. Defending digital infrastructure or cybersecurity in a very broad way, and the threat of China. And so the fact that now some of these bills that have already passed the Senate getting hung up in the House, I think eventually parts of them will get passed in order to improve our competitiveness when it comes with China. But democracy is complicated. Democracy is messy. Democracy has always been fragile. It always will be fragile, but it requires us and those that care about this to paint a picture. And when it comes to China, the Chinese government is trying to surpass the United States as the global superpower. I say it so much. I think everybody understands this. Not everybody understands this. This is not my opinion or me sleeping in my bed at night, pondering about the world. This is what the Chinese government has said about themselves in English. Let's take them at this. Some have said that maybe we're overestimating the Chinese government the way we overestimated Russia or the way we overestimated Japan's prowess. The difference is that they are 4 times as large as the United States. That was not the case with Japan. That was not the case of Russia. So we have to be 4 times as effective in order to make sure that we're able to compete. And how Congress works matters. Our friends are watching. The fact that when it comes to Ukraine, the number of countries in the Middle East, Latin America, and broader Asia that are not supportive in these sanctions against Russia is an indication that people are playing the sides because they don't want to upset the Chinese. They don't want to upset America. And we've taken for granted some of those alliances. Matt, I don't know if that hits your question, but these are some of the issues that they're complicated. You can't solve these in 280 characters on Twitter. It requires a competition of ideas between Republicans and Democrats to find that solution that best fits for our country.
Yeah, I've always thought the magic in public policy comes from the interaction between the two sides, not either side acting by itself, as you alluded to earlier, Congressman.
I kind of follow up a little bit what Representative Hurd was talking about, and ask you all to think either globally or here at home, where you might see some hope of people acting on either the principles or the ideals that you all espouse, where you might see that being put into action. Representative Hurd, you're talking about perhaps China may be a galvanizing force or digital technology. So where do you all see these principles, ideals, perhaps being put into action?
So I would start with, I have felt over the last 7 months, there has been a change in the electorate. The electorate, there was a recent poll that came out that 88% of the country thinks the country's on the wrong track. The last time I had seen the same poll, and this is one of those companies that have been doing this for 30 years, it was 72%. And that's a striking, bipartisan a feeling of being upset. We got to do something different. And Democrats recognize that, Republicans recognize that. And I always believe that we want to be inspired by something better than ourselves, not just the worst of our natures being targeted by fear mongers. And the cooperation on China is interesting. The cooperation, and again, I think one of the highlights of some of the things this administration has been doing, along with Republicans, is defending against digital attacks. That's unique. The fact that the amount of support that we have seen going to our brothers and sisters in Ukraine has been done in a bipartisan way. And so I think those are things and where we can build upon success. And look, we can talk about gun legislation. The fact that Chris Murphy and John Cornyn, who were taking a lot of arrows from their own sides, we're willing to work together, and we pass something overwhelmingly bipartisanship. Now, that was a step. We need more of those steps. But the fact that something like that could have happened in the partisan environment that we're dealing with in our country is a glimmer of hope.
Senator Lieberman, you get the last word here.
Yeah. So let's sort of come back a little bit, step back to first principles. This is really a question of leadership, and I say respectfully, but explicitly, too many of our leaders in Washington have lost their nerve, and they're unwilling to take the risks, and they're not big risks. The risk to work across party lines to get something done, and because they're afraid about whether they're going to get reelected or not. At some point, a light has to go on in people's heads where they say, geez, at the end of this incredible experience I've had, an honor, privilege to be in Congress, do I want to say I just played it safe so I got reelected 2 or 3 or 4 times? Or do I want to say, I took a risk on that one, but I found people in the other party to join with me and I got something big done. And of course, for the sake of our country, not just for their own mental health after their service, I think they've got to do that more. To me, the problem of climate change is getting worse and worse. And there's strong feelings on both sides, but believe me, there can be constructive legislation here. And the public sees it, and all the extreme weather and wildfires and all the rest. So I think some guts would go toward ameliorating this problem. The other one I wish would happen, I think one of the best things that's happened in the world in recent times is the so-called Abraham Accords, in which there was a historic breakthrough between Israel and 4 Muslim Arab countries. We ought to try to build on that, and the key missing link now, Saudi Arabia, will not get involved in that, even though I know them and I think they want to, unless they're convinced that the United States will not get into another bad agreement with Iran, which threatens them and the Israelis and the other Arab Gulf countries. So I hope there can be a return to bipartisanship on Iran for the sake of peace in the Middle East, which is what used to exist before the nuclear agreement in 2015. Anyway, there's a lot of work to do, but with some common sense and a bit of a backbone and more elected officials in Washington, this is not really heavy lifting. We can get our country back on the road to being a more perfect union again.